So hi, everybody, and welcome to our live Fireside Chat. This Fireside Chat is a part of our pandemic recovery series, which we host, in which we host challenges and events as a way to find healthcare innovators who want to participate in data-driven, disruptive, innovative co-design projects that tackle first-line challenges that were created by the pandemic. And we have actually just launched our Health System Analytics Design Challenge, which aims to accelerate innovation-based projects by helping participants navigate the many barriers faced in adopting, commercializing, and scaling effective products. So if you are curious to find out more about our challenges, our Michiko has shared a link to our challenge web pages in the chat. So I do encourage you to go check those out. If we have time at the end of our session today, I will quickly go into a bit more detail about that. But for today, we do have the board chair of Colleaga, Dan Gordon, moderating a chat with Balaji Gopalan, co-founder and CEO at MedStack, a cloud software platform that automates data privacy compliance and security for digital health. Just a few quick housekeeping notes before we get started. We are asking everyone to leave off their video during the call today, as well as put themselves on mute, just to reduce any background noise or distraction. Please do feel free to ask any questions in the chat. If we do have time at the end, we'll try and get to a few of them and answer some of them. Please also take a moment now to introduce yourself. Let us know where you're coming from. We'd love to know who joined us today. If you do have any technical issues throughout our call today, you can reach out to Michiko and she'll help you out. But with that being said, I will now pass it over to Dan Gordon to begin the chat for us.
Thank you, Katie, and welcome everybody. I'm extremely delighted to be speaking with Balaji Gopalan, who is not only CEO of MedStack, but he is a product management guru, if I can call it that, Balaji, without, and is also a great Canadian social entrepreneur. Over the past 2 decades, Balaji has had an incredible front row seat and a unique lived experience of the power of exponentially accelerating disruptive innovation. And that's really what we're going to talk about today. Balaji, take us back to 2004. There was only one real consumer communications device around, and it wasn't the iPhone, it was the Blackberry. Take us back to your time on the Blackberry product management team and how you landed up in the skunkworks inventing the Blackberry Messenger. Before there were iPhones, what was that like?
Yeah, thanks, Dan. First of all, thank you very much for inviting me today and for the Colleaga team on the incredible partnership. We're very excited about what you guys are doing and the steps we're going to be taking in fostering innovation in this industry and others as well. Yeah, I mean, I reflect back on those days, which is now a long time ago, quite often, because it's really colored a lot of my experiences in driving sort of the innovation ecosystem. If you go back to 2004, I would even go so far as to say even BlackBerry at the time, which the company wasn't even called BlackBerry, it was called Research in Motion, wasn't considered even to be a consumer company. And what had actually happened was the original brilliant invention that Mike Lazaridis had come up with was this idea that email was something that business people, whether they were self-employed or working for a company, found instrumental to them being successful and carried through the day. But email was tethered to being at a desktop, and people would go to meetings. That was actually the original inspiration. And so the original device was a two-way paging system that allowed you to get messages with a small rectangular device that you could carry on your hip. And of course this took off, and it was a tool that was sold to enterprises via the IT department in similar ways that you would receive sort of corporate desktop computers and other such things, and enabling the workflows within those companies. But what was really interesting was that from a user paradigm, the individuals that had access to Blackberries, and actually my first exposure was in my previous role at another Canadian institution, which was Bombardier. I remember there was an executive who had this device, and I was so fascinated how he'd look down in the middle of a meeting and answer messages. People would see that and they would notice that people were being much more productive. But what was interesting is some of the people who were making those observations didn't have an IT department. They were real estate agents, they were stockbrokers, they were day traders, they were lawyers who worked for themselves. And immediately the company was getting feedback saying, well, is there a way for us to get access to that without requiring us to install a server in an IT department? And the wireless carriers, who at the time had a business of selling cell phones to consumers, which were doing phone calls, long distance and text messages, and maybe downloading ringtones. I had one of those too. And was making some business through strategic partnerships and service contracts with enterprises. Saw a tremendous opportunity for expanding the way that consumers, and initially what we called prosumers, were doing communications. And so there was this department that was created saying, can we take the BlackBerry proposition and sell it through a carrier to an individual directly? And it was almost, as you say, a skunkworks project, because it was very much antithetical to the way that the company had been built, its culture around these relationships with enterprises. I mean, BlackBerry's conference at the time was called WES, was the Wireless Enterprise Symposium, and only later on did it get changed to something else. So, you know, it was really fascinating. I met some of the smartest people that I've ever known in that role, and really brilliant forward thinkers. And disruptive innovation was absolutely part of the conversation, which is we were taking a paradigm and changing it for the needs of a segment. And one of the first questions that was being asked in this group was, well, now if we're enabling real-time digital communications, that was a key, because BlackBerry was unique in that we had an infrastructure that was connected to the internet, that was securely connected to the devices. We were not just a hardware company, we weren't an internet company, we were both. And if we had this, what kinds of experiences could we create for people if more people had this access? And the first thing that came up at the time, the next generation of the internet, was instant messaging. This was the time of AOL Instant Messenger and ICQ, and up in Canada, we were all using what we referred to as MSN, which was Microsoft's messaging platform before they acquired Skype, although we actually did talk to Skype at the same time as well. And so that was my role, was looking at how new technologies could be brought to add to this proposition to enhance the user experience and utility. And so that was one of the first things I looked at, just to give a amusing cultural paradigm. The other project I was looking at the time was this crazy idea of having a cell phone have Wi-Fi access. It was considered really radical, and we were looking at those kinds of things as well. It was really fun. We were a startup in the way that a startup disrupts a paradigm, but we were a startup inside a larger company, and that was actually the paradigm shift. And you know, there's, I think, 3 areas of disruption we thought about. The first was helping our own company to think differently. I remember presenting to a group of sales leaders within BlackBerry, and they kind of were scratching their heads and going, why would anybody want instant messaging on a phone? And I said, you know, the reason you're asking that question is because you work at BlackBerry. And everybody in this company has a BlackBerry. I went through 13 phones when I was there because I kept getting the new ones. But most people in the world don't. And so if you're restricted to communications on a desktop, then you have to wait to get to a desktop to talk to somebody. And we were even questioning things like status that says away or available, because it changes in an IM context. But here we all have BlackBerry. So if you want to, hey Dan, you want to grab lunch? I could email you and I know I'll get a response right away, but the rest of the world doesn't think that way. And so that was the paradigm shift we were changing. The second one was changing the industry to think about a new kind of protocol and a way of operating and communicating with this device, and what that would actually mean to our channel partners, which was the wireless carriers. And the third was introducing a new business for people who are in that space. So we went to you know, I traveled to Sunnyvale. I went to the head offices of Yahoo and said, we have this incredible opportunity for you. Right now, mobile has just been putting a Yahoo layer on top of things that the wireless carriers do in text messaging. What if we could do typing notifications, group messages, pictures, emojis, which weren't even called emojis back then, they were called emoticons, and on a phone? And they were blown away by the concept. And they actually gave us access to their desktop protocol to build Yahoo Instant Messenger for BlackBerry, which we were the only company in the world that had that. And that was the genesis of what would eventually become this new approach, which was an even more secret project called BlackBerry Messenger.
It's amazingly interesting, and so many parallels with my experience of being in the IBM Global Center of Competence in Healthcare. And also being in the situation of being an internal entrepreneur and trying to change a company culture and disrupting internally, and then also thinking about an external market. So the Christian Claytonson example, you're in BlackBerry and you're disrupting your own market. And trying to move from enterprise to consumer and going through that shift of creating a new market with new value chains. And then in 2007, 3 years later, iPhone gets released, and now you're the market incumbent and you are being disrupted. So how did you think about things then, about your product and your competitive positioning?
Yeah, it was, we were all talking about it, obviously, the notion that one of the most interesting new consumer electronics brands in the world was rumored to be building a phone. And of course, if you look at technology history, the iPhone was actually not Apple's first foray into mobile. Their first foray into mobile was a partnership with Motorola on a device called the Moto Rocker. And there's great urban legend stories about the way that, the brilliant Steve Jobs had judoed that entire thing to set the market up ready for the iPhone. But we knew it was happening, and it was a big coup within BlackBerry, because up until that point, smartphones, at least in the market around here, was it was BlackBerry, it was Palm, it was Windows Mobile, Danger, this little company in the US had this thing called the Sidekick, and then you had these very powerful but really kind of hardware-centric plays in Europe with Sony Ericsson and Nokia and others. But this idea of internet-connected devices was a very, very new idea. And the thought that Apple was going to create one, especially when Apple had been quiet for a long time because Steve had left and come back, and they now introduced the new version of the Mac, and the iPod was taking off. We didn't know what to think. But our perception was that Apple wasn't a business company, they were a consumer company. And so smartphones, if you look at the list of names I provided, they were all targeting business users. So, the whole kind of market reacted. Those of us in product management buzzed. Mike and Jim brought us together and said, we understand this is something you guys are thinking about. We're going to do some research. And it was, in hindsight, it's a classical example of why Clayton Christensen's framework works so well. We were the dominant name. I mean, the biggest carriers in the world told us we made more money for them than anybody. And we were defining this industry. We were bringing the internet companies to mobile, and we were changing the way that people thought about mobile data. But when we talked to our customers and our channels, we talked to the wireless carriers, we talked to the government agencies. Of course, the US military was a big customer of ours, and the finance departments and the banks. We talked to our users, we talked to the IT managers, they all said, it's all about staying connected when you're moving around. So therefore, being conservative on bandwidth, being conservative on battery life, and being conservative on security matter more than anything else. And we were saying to ourselves, Apple's not really known for doing those things really well. And then more and more rumors about the iPhone came out. And we actually got phone calls from our customers who said, for goodness sake, please don't get distracted. We love what you do and keep doing it, which is what happens in disruptive innovation. Apple didn't have any customers for the iPhone yet, but the thing that they did have was a lot of customers for the iPod and iTunes. And here's where I think the most brilliant disruption actually happened, is the paradigm that everybody thought about, in North America at least, was if you're a device manufacturer, you sold to a carrier, they were your channel. The BlackBerry phones used to have the carrier logos at the top. Every phone did, no matter who made it. And they decided what went in, what didn't. But we all know how the iPhone started, right? So Apple said, we're going to bring the brilliant brand equity of Apple to mobile. We're going to bring the user base of the iPod and iTunes to mobile. But there's no carrier branding on the phone, and we're going to have our own app store, which the first iPhone didn't even launch with an app store, but they told the carriers they were going to do it, which was terrifying. And of course there was thoughts about security and bandwidth and battery life, because Apple knew the importance of media, which up until now, everything I've said was around messaging. So they knew media was the next big thing, because they were looking at gaming devices and such things. And so they said, no, we're going to have a desktop quality browser on a phone. And of course, everybody was terrified about what that would do to the bandwidth. We didn't even have 3G back then. First iPhone launched with 2G connectivity. And of course, when it did, it changed everything because the carriers didn't know how to sell it, but it sold itself. And then Apple had the Apple Store, the actual physical store, which they also used the channel, and none of the rest of us had that. And it took a while for things to change because they went around the channel to the consumer, got an install base, and then we all heard what happened is that the teenagers grew up and got jobs and were given Blackberries. And they said, why in the world would I carry 2 devices? I have one already, let me use that. And this is where BYOD came from. It was fascinating to watch. We tried a lot of things to catch up. There's the ill-fated whole story about the BlackBerry Storm, which was the first kind of full touchscreen device thing, where we tried to do something different to pick up on what we were known for, but the execution was a little bit outside of our comfort zone, and the history continued as it is. And now, of course, Apple is in a position where a lot of people are kind of wondering, well, what might happen to them? Will they be disrupted? Right. And we have really, brilliant companies that are doing some really interesting things in this space. And as a product academic, it's really fascinating to watch.
It's also interesting that at the same time that this was going on, there was a parallel situation to Canada happening in Finland. Mm-hmm. And you had mentioned Nokia. Nokia was also a large homegrown multinational, and they were bought out. And with it, Finland lost the innovation universe of technology suppliers and startups that were built up around them. And actually, as the innovation lead then I was working with the Finnish government to try and figure out new strategies to create new platforms that connected startups generating innovation to consumers of innovation, much like you were doing at BlackBerry. And their impetus was, and I remember the Finnish Minister of Finance saying, I have 60 mobile engineers who are incredibly highly trained, but I don't find jobs for them and startups for them to work in. They are going to go to the EU and they will never come back. Mm-hmm. So it's this thinking about you had a platform, and to what extent do you think that the platform is about connecting consumers and producers of value? And how much do you actually need a device to make the platform work, if at all?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, and that that's such a fascinating story too, because in its DNA, and the way it started, BlackBerry was at its core, it was a hardware company. The BlackBerry of old was a hardware company. Partially that was because, Mike's brilliance, a lot of it comes from electronics engineering and hardware engineering and things like that. He was very close to the hardware team. To the degree that the identifier, which was such an alien concept back then, this idea of an account. Now we have accounts for everything. But if you go back 15 years, this idea of an account was such a new concept. We might have had an email address and that was really it. The account for BlackBerry was actually the identifier of the hardware. And so for anybody who's ever used BlackBerry Messenger, what I'm talking about is the PIN, the product identification. And it was this concept that was created so that the BlackBerry network would know where to route messages. We had this product called Relay that did that I was the product manager for. And so we said, well, that's how we'll find people, because it's the most secure thing. It's a bit of a hashed ID. We know what your PIN is. We can send you the PIN. But eventually, once the lines started blurring across the internet, we started asking questions around, well, now we've got a brand identity that goes beyond the hardware. People are just part of this ecosystem. And we started looking at things like, well, BlackBerry email maybe on another device. And then, the biggest sort of disruptor for this whole thing was the introduction of our first tablet, which was the BlackBerry Playbook, which not a lot of people remember now. But that was significant for 2 reasons. The first was, it was the first device to run a brand new operating system. So BlackBerry had acquired an Ottawa company called QNX, which was this quiet giant, because they powered the back-end operations of things like, GM OnStar and the Canadarm on the space shuttle and submarine detectors, because they had this microkernel architecture, which is really powerful and extremely energy efficient. But it required a different operating system. So we had a new operating system which would allow us to attack and coordinate with the new ecosystem of developers that had grown up on the iPhone. They were web developers. But now we had people with 2 devices. So could we route messages depending on which device they were using? And underneath that was the creation of what was a brand new direction for BlackBerry, which was this product called Blackberry ID, which was something that I was behind, that was a digital identifier for BlackBerry. Now you had an account, and it tied into the App Store, and it tied into email, and it tied into even things like accessories accounts and the hardware as well. We really started asking ourselves questions around, what do people value? Because we started learning that people thought of BlackBerry as this sort of aspirational community to be a part of, especially even outside North America. For example, I mean, there's a few markets that come up almost randomly, but they became cultural paradigms. Venezuela was one, Indonesia was another, South Africa was another, where the BlackBerry Messenger, BlackBerry Pen, and the BlackBerry ID became this thing that people would use to identify themselves. There's a great story about like people would tattoo their BlackBerry pin numbers on their arms in Saudi Arabia. You know, we had these kinds of things happening. So it was a really, really, really hard transition for us, and we struggled, to be honest. And this isn't a dick cry against anybody who worked there, because some of the smartest people I ever met worked there. But just keeping up with this transformation that was happening around us, because we didn't start out as an internet company. We started as a hardware company. We're becoming an internet company, and that was really tricky. But the brilliant thing we did figure out was having the hardware as an endpoint allowed us to go after people with communities already and help them reach and talk to their communities more often. But then when we were creating our own, we now had to figure out where we were saying, did we want to compete against Facebook? Like, that was a question we had to ask ourselves. And we had to carve a niche where we said, here's what we're not going to do. We take advantage of them and help them be successful. And here's what we can do to protect our own interests and drive the consumer attention in the right way between the 2 places. And a constant conversation that we had. In the end, BlackBerry actually stepped back and went back to sort of their pedigree of hardware, especially when Torsten Heinz took over as CEO, which was absolutely the right move at the time, because it's what they did well.
And so at that time, sort of related, I think maybe around 2012, I'm thinking, so there you are. BlackBerry has contracted significantly. You've gone from tens of millions of users to millions. You had millions of devices out in the field. It's now down to tens or hundreds of thousands. The whole ton of stock value has been vaporized, and you're thinking about that your BlackBerry adventure is at an end. What's next? You've got all this experience of having developed these channel partners, and you could go in the direction of hardware, but you've been involved with an ecosystem of developers and seen how platforms work. And so tell us a little bit about how you met your technology co-founder and your decision to go the entrepreneurial route.
Yeah, it's interesting. If you'd asked me back then, what would you think about you being a founder of a company? I would have said, I hadn't really ever thought about it. You know, I guess, you know, for me personally, if I could kind of talk about my own sort of view on my career and the role I play. Like many other geeks in the world, I'm a Star Trek fan, and I always kind of thought about the relationship between the captain and the first officer. You know, I don't have a military background, or even if that's even the right analogy, but I really loved how one would be, you know, the vision maker and the external face, and then another would just make sure everything runs internally. And most of my career at BlackBerry, if you talk about job titles, I was a product manager or head of product management, and I really got fascinated by that as a career. Because I realized how important it was. Product is actually still relatively new, and not a lot of people understand what it is. And I had some amazing mentors in the field of product management at BlackBerry, who came from all sorts of incredible companies. there's this sort of saying that I think, maybe I'm misquoting, might date back to Mark Andreessen, I'm not sure, that says product managers are the CEOs of their companies, or CEOs of their products. I actually came to think that that's an incorrect analogy. And I've also had this conversation extensively with the product manager of my own company. I think product managers are the COOs, and the COO's role, because I've worked with some amazing COOs, is to orchestrate resources and to empower them in the things that they do well to deliver on the vision. And I really, really enjoyed doing that. And that is what I wanted to do. But then when I left BlackBerry, I found myself in a very strange position, because that company had developed this really sticky kind of brand identity, and it wasn't a good one, rightly or wrongly. And I'm not saying that it was a fair assessment, but the world was generally saying, BlackBerry failed and it didn't do all these things, but I think is actually kind of unfair. But my whole career was defined by this company. And so I took like a good 9 months to sort of think about what am I other than a guy who worked at BlackBerry? And the thing that I realized was I'd become really fascinated with this notion of product strategy and platforms. How do you build technology to help other people do stuff? Because that was the most exciting work I'd done. Whether it was enabling the internet companies to go mobile, whether it was enabling the carriers to message the power of mobile data to the consumer community, whether it was enabling developers to build apps. When one little tiny project we did that I'm actually really proud of is we exposed BlackBerry's secure push technology, which was unique in the world, as an API for third-party developers. And people did some really, really cool stuff on that. So that's kind of the direction I wanted to take. And so I started a career as a product leader in platform strategy. And I started jumping from industry to industry, and mostly at startups, where with each experience, I realized I was building something, and more than just orchestrating a vision. I was building vision because these companies said, we need to figure out our platform strategy. So, I did it in an ed tech company. I did it in a marketing tech company. I did it in a media company. And it was all around what kind of partnerships should you build so that our proposition gets told to a larger audience through their audience and their channel, which eventually landed me at a very incredible company that when I heard about, I reached out to the COO of that company, who is a former, somebody I'd worked with and somebody I admired very much. And I literally just said, can I learn about your product? And that company at the time was a company called Bionym. Bionym was a wearable technology company, and in Toronto in a little bit past 2010, 2012, there was this renaissance of amazing wearable tech companies. It was like the next thing we were going to do. What they had is a wristband. It came out of a bunch of research at the University of Toronto from an incredible cryptologist and identity researcher that would measure the shape of your electrocardiogram, but not for a health reason. They would actually use it as a digital identifier, like a fingerprint or an iris. But the incredible thing about the ECG is it's inside your body, so you can't spoof it. And so identity gurus have been trying to chase this for decades, and U of T research actually figured out how to do it. So this company, which I graduated from Next36 and CDL, was called Bionym. I met with the CEO saying, can I buy one of the devices? Because I finally saw what I'd wanted to do with BlackBerry and digital identity being done. We had the same similar ideas around using hardware as proxies for ID. By the end of the breakfast meeting, it was with the incredibly brilliant Andrew D'Souza, of course, we all know is now the founder of ClearBank. I was working for him. And so I joined that company, which would later be rebranded as NIMI, which was the name of the product. And I built their developer ecosystem story as head of platform. We were about to launch the SDK to the developer world, allow people to build apps that you use the identifier from the NIMI band. And we had a weekend hackathon, ordered some pizza. We just called people in the community, said, come on by, hack on it. We'll put you in groups and we'll just do some demos, and we'll film you for our website. And this one gentleman came, and he was very imposing because he was quite tall. And I was like, who is this guy? But he just talked differently than anybody else there. He had a real product sensibility about him in a kind of casual, let's think about the user and the problem they want to solve sort of way. And they built the best demo in the room. We gave them the prize. We filmed an interview with him. I interviewed him and went on our merry way. NIMI would eventually do a pretty massive pivot. Again, very similar to BlackBerry's pivot back to hardware. It was a right move for them. They're now doing really well they found a niche, which is ironically in healthcare. But I left the company and people heard about it. And this gentleman called me back and said, do you remember me? I ran this agency in Waterloo and we came to your NIMI hackathon because we actually thought it was a healthcare thing, but even though it wasn't. Can we meet? This gentleman's name is Simon Woodside. And I would learn that the reason he had that product sensibility about him partially is because after he finished his schooling in computer science at Waterloo, he went to work for Apple. And that's where he kind of got this sensibility. And he told me about this problem. Simon was working at a development agency called Monolith or that was his company. He founded it in Waterloo, and they were full stack mobile app development. They did a number of different interesting things, but they got into healthcare. And he said, every time somebody hires me to build a healthcare app with this team of 10, going to market is really hard. They keep sending me all these lawyers. And I said, why is that? He said, because we have to prove that our application manages data in the way that their customers expect, patient data, health data. And I said, are you telling me it's the same work every time? He said, yeah. There's no platform to do this? And he said, what do you mean? I said, well, I told him about my thoughts around platform strategy. And he said, no, and I think we need to create one. And that was the genesis of MedStack. But the very first thing we did was, because it was such a crazy idea, is I didn't believe him. So Simon is the organizer of the Hacking Health meetup in Hamilton. I had ties in as a mentor into Next Canada and the DMZ and Velocity. So we talked to a number of really early stage digital health vendors, and they all told us consistently, I love what I'm doing. I'm helping patients, I'm helping providers. I'm using data to make healthcare work better. But this compliance thing consistently gets in my way. And we said, oh, well, founders have a lot of challenges. So maybe it's just a bunch of founders who are complaining. So then we booked some meetings with some hospital folks, and they said the most shocking thing to me, which was, the quote was as follows: we are beholden by the law to protect the safety of our patients. It's our patients, and do no harm. I would later find out, actually, that privacy is mentioned in the 1968 rewrite of the Hippocratic Oath for exactly this reason. So when we work with a vendor, we have to make sure they're managing our patients, in other words, our patient safety, in other words, our patient's data, in the right way. But we don't have time to dig into everybody's code. So we just say no to everything. And I was like, are you happy with it? No, there's this perception healthcare doesn't like technology, and it's fundamentally untrue, because the biggest pressure on healthcare at the time, in 2015, was chronic conditions, which it still is. Diabetes, cancer, mental illness, heart condition, long-term relationships with patients, complex symptoms, lots of people involved in care. And so the in-person, on-premise, real-time nature on paper of healthcare, which came from the war, doesn't really meet that. And therefore in Canada, we have long wait times. I myself have just gotten an appointment for a procedure, which is going to be in March of next year. Mm-hmm. And US, imbalanced access to care. And so the healthcare industry is very desperate for more technology, but not at the risk of the safety of their patients. And they found themselves in this dichotomy. And we said, we're going to go solve that problem. And that's how MedStack was born.
Well, so in another interesting parallel, I arrived in Canada in 1991, and I started doing my PhD in health system management, and we needed to eat. And so I also worked at the same time, and I ended up being the special projects lead at Sunnybrook Health Science Center, building the new electronic patient record. And in spades, I mean, I was back then, the internal entrepreneur trying to say, we're going to bring in a new electronic patient record. We had Oasis, which was at the time was the world-beating platform. It was based on the guys who invented HL7. Mm-hmm. And getting that in, the only reason really it got in was because Y2K was coming up. And I remember our team would meet in the Sunnybrook cafeteria and say, what can we tell them, what can't we tell? But we've got to say that it's going to happen because it has to happen. Mm-hmm. And the pushback was both on the privacy side, with the old school health data resources and patient records, saying that the only good patient record is one that is in our shelf and nobody can find it. And how can you let the data get out and all of that stuff, with a natural tendency in healthcare to be rather averse to adopting innovation quickly. The lemon as the cure to scurvy was found out in 1750, and it only got adopted by the Royal Navy 250 years later as a cure. So healthcare does tend to be very, very slow. But I think that in some ways, the idea that it's only about patient safety is a bit of an excuse. It's also it's a cultural aspect, and so I'm wondering that so you're meeting Simon, you're deciding to do this, and you're building a platform, but the industry is it's way behind. It's slow. It's highly regulated. Did you ever think, why do I want to bother with healthcare? Why don't I do something else that's easier?
Yeah, definitely. It's a really great question, Dan. One of the first questions we faced when we're talking to investors and people kind of evaluating our business from the beginning was, you guys are a digital health company. So we think of digital health companies from the lens of, okay, we're selling into healthcare. So what does healthcare think about what you're doing? Because there was this skepticism, especially from people who weren't in healthcare, who said, this is never going to work. It's never going to fly. And we said, well, that's the fair question, because we had a similar sort of perspective that you did. And I would gain some insight on that over time. But then we said, well, let's go back to why we thought about creating this. And if you go back to, a few minutes ago to how I explained the story, the inspiration for MedStack actually didn't come from hospitals and insurance companies and government agencies. It actually came from founders. And so when we looked at why people were creating these companies, because it just seems like it was so hard to do, it was exactly for that same reason. It was the need to change things. And every one of the founders we met, every single one, and have met since, created their company because they were a patient or they were a healthcare provider, such as a physician or a nurse. Side note, like nurse entrepreneurs are some of my favorite people because they just are motivated by the most amazing things. Or family member thereof. And they said, it's gotta work differently. I don't understand why something so fundamental to people living works so inefficiently. And it is not for a want of not wanting to be different. I mean, healthcare policymakers are all the time talking about how to make it work better. And we had a conversation about that, and I was like, well, that's exactly how disruptive innovation works. Let's go back. How did Apple disrupt BlackBerry? Well, because Apple didn't have any baggage, but it had assets. So how do we apply that analogy here? The way we apply that analogy here is entrepreneurial thinking. That's the asset. People that have created companies before, or inspired by people who created companies before, or amazingly young people who don't have any of the skepticism or emotional baggage, saying it's got to be different, and I'm going to do it differently. And I know you can't change, but I'm going to help you change. And this is why platforms are so important. And so the thing we noticed is that all these digital health companies were doing just one little tiny thing, but that's their whole mission. Whether it's changing a department in a hospital. So, like one example is that I've seen coming up more and more now is digital pathology, which I think is just so fascinating. How do you go from these like glass slides that people would put in a box to an image on a screen and determine, do things like biopsies and figure out what's actually going on? Whether it's a department or a specific population, let's create a better experience for our beloved seniors and their elder years and make healthcare work better for them. Or a particular type of medical condition, diabetes comes up a lot. Of course, mental illness comes up a lot because so many of us have struggled with these kinds of things, or no loved ones who have. They were always inspired by one thing, as opposed to the orthogonal view of healthcare before, which was it's just healthcare, which is this big giant entity. And that's the issue, right? Is that the people who would say no before weren't concerned about these individual things, not because they were unfeeling, but their job was overall infrastructure. So I can't manage that one thing. So I'm just going to put a blanket policy that says you can't. It's got to be on premise and it's got to be on paper and backed up to a floppy disk and things like that. So we said, well, how do we just make them more successful? They're not all going to be successful, but one will get through, because we saw it happen in all these other industries, this platform disruption, whether it was messaging or whether it was, media or whatever. We just kept seeing platform disruptions come from startups So we said, we're going to go and just be in the background and help them. And how can we help them? We're going to help them deliver a stronger, less ignorable message to the enterprises they talk to, going, you don't need to be afraid. Here's our security posture in your language. And you know, that's what we did. And we got a lot of pushback because a lot of people said, there's no money. Startups have no money. Go sell to a hospital. And we talked to the hospitals, and every time the hospitals would say, are you telling me? And by the way, it was the chief innovation officers we talked to, the people who wanted more innovation, who were frustrated by their own colleagues in privacy and security, who were to other departments. Are you telling me that you can bring me a bunch of innovative startups who think faster and wider and more aggressive than we do, and they will actually pass all of my barriers I have internally? And I said, that's what we do. And they said, amazing. Introduce me to all your customers. We don't know how to buy you, and I can't even politically kind of buy you, but I'm really interested in talking to your customers. And that was the thing. That was the moment we said, we're not just a software company, we're an ecosystem. And so if you talk to our customers today, fast forward 5 years, you will hear that they like working with MedStack because, you know, sure, you know, we're working on our user experience to make it easier to integrate with our platform. We have rock solid security, but the bigger reason is because we help them with their customers and they're part of a community. We introduce them to customer opportunities, to investors, to each other. In fact, we do case studies on them, and we talk about their story because, you know, we're a plumbing company. It's not that interesting. What our customers do is amazing, and they would have a lot of trouble delivering more value to patients and providers without us. And so we set ourselves on that mission, and we said, people aren't going to get it, but it's the way we have to do it.
It's a fascinating, it's an amazing approach because, you know, everybody needs plumbing. Even if it isn't sexy, and having a very well-defined value proposition to say, we're going to give you a piece of plumbing you absolutely have to have, otherwise you can't sell. But the value add is everything on top of that, because that's what we're really thinking about.
Yes, exactly right.
It is an amazing approach. And so if you're just thinking then about the ecosystem that you're both creating and that you're a part of, what's your vision for the MedStack product moving forward?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, fundamentally, it comes down to this idea that if you're going to take the brave steps in entrepreneurship, you know, which is hard, it's a hard life, right? So you're taking a pay cut, maybe pay cut to zero in the beginning. You're talking about things that people aren't comfortable and used to hearing about, different ways that things are going. You're taking risks on new technologies that are you know, not fully proven in the market. And you're facing the barriers of inertia. You should make those kinds of sacrifices to do something that really, really matters. And I read a paper on this some 10 years ago, even while I was at Blackberry, which really stuck with me ever since then. Entrepreneurship not only has the best ability to help us do things better, but has a responsibility to do so. And these basically net out to like 5 industries that govern everyday life in society across cultural paradigms and societal norms and economic divides, et cetera. And those are, you know, the environment and climate and energy, financial services and economy and balance of economy, education, government, and healthcare. And so we see ourselves on a mission to invite more entrepreneurs, because we really believe in their ability to change the way we do things, to choose healthcare as a path for application of their vision and their desire for invention. And so underneath that is a whole bunch of things they all have to deal with to be successful. Some are particular to them, many are not, and they're just barriers to proceeding. You know, it's like taking any major step in life. You've got to do a bunch of things. I'm moving house. Well, I've got to worry about all this legal stuff as a moving house, that kind of thing. So can we make a list of all of those things? And how do we create a paradigm that turns into a turnkey solution that says, if I just go there, I'm going to get everything. I'm going to get my toolbox of all the things I need, and I can just invent. And the first thing we've done is automating privacy and security, but there's other things we think about. Those things are, development resources and data sets for things like clinical trials and integration engines into EHRs, and pre-built AI engines, and even non-technical things. Like, what about business things? Every digital health company needs a cyber liability policy, insurance policy. If you're building a video game, you may not need that, but if you're building digital health, you absolutely do need that. Okay, well, we partnered early on in our company with a great Canadian company called Zensurance to help our customers get cyber liability insurance. What about advisory services? So can we partner with organizations like Colleaga, for example, to help our customers get best guidance specific to digital health? What about customers? Can we have a customer site that's willing to take on startups that they know will meet all of these requirements? And then finally, even what about investors? So we're thinking about a stack of all of these things that we can provide in sort of a clearinghouse for our customers. Very few of them we're going to build. All of them will require cloud services and security in the cloud. But now we'd like to take our ecosystem of companies and invite other service providers to partner with them. And that's the next thing that we're going to think about with MedStack.
So that's the real definition of SaaS, service becoming software. Mm-hmm. And so you've had experiences in different accelerators that have tried more or less successfully to provide this sort of basket of we can give you business advice and modeling advice and a set of partners and cloud credits and a bunch of other things. In your experience through DreamIt in Philadelphia or through 500 startups, what have been the accelerators that have stuck in your mind as being the ones that have been most valuable to you?
Yeah, great question. I remember that the gentleman who used to run the accelerator program at 500 in Mountain View, Marvin Lau, is a brilliant thinker. He wasn't shy about making fun of us as the company who are accelerator junkies. We did a few programs, more than what a lot of companies do. We started at the DMZ incubator when it was an incubation space back then. It's a very different model now. We went to DreamIt. We came back. We did CDL. And actually, while we were doing CDL, we were doing the Canadian Tech Accelerator at the same time. And then we went to 500, and we'd actually come back to the DMZ and do their accelerator program beginning of last year. I almost wouldn't even really pick one because I think we learned something from all of them. The two areas for us, we're a learning organization. Simon and I really come from a perspective that there's a lot we don't know, and the more we admit that to ourselves, the better we will be, because then it shows that you're charting uncharted territory, and you're being more innovative, and you're being more aggressive, and you're being more disruptive. So there's always inputs we can get. Those inputs don't always agree, and we have to synthesize them and decide where we're going to go. I've been around startups for a really, really long time. Again, the story of MedStack was I was inspired by the problem, not saying I have to become a founder myself, but I said my only role in solving this problem is to become a founder. And so I took a very, I aspire, humble approach to this role. He's a serial entrepreneur, but he's had failings. And he said, there's definitely things I need to know. And MedStack's gone farther than his other initiatives have before. But we learned a few interesting things. And there's this sort of confluence of factors, which usually what I see with these programs is they choose which sort of levers they want to pull. Whether that's industry or stage of company or focus area, there's advantages to all of them. So, working with the amazing folks at DreamIt, we're still in touch with to this day, 4.5 years later. They really helped us understand the U.S. healthcare system and the buying process because of their connections into healthcare enterprises. I mean, we in the first week there, through their what they call customer immersion program, we were in front of Pfizer and Merck and Penn State Medical and Columbia and a bunch of others. With 500, it was all about understanding, the Silicon Valley investment thesis, how to present yourself as a company, the brilliance around customer marketing and digital marketing. We just got so much stuff from there that we still use to this day. CDL is a very sort of practical, milestone-based program. And the biggest thing we got out of CDL was discipline, product discipline. They said, what are you going to do? And we're going to ask you if you've done it. And they pushed us really, really hard. And of course, we got our first few angel investments out of CDL, which we're in touch with some brilliant folks like Highline Beta and Barney Pell and a few others to this day. We learned something different at each point. And of course, our customers are startups. So we got great lead gen from all of these programs. We met some of our first customers at Dream It who are still with us even today. Some people are reticent about accelerators, and I got to tell you that there's always stuff you think you know that you may not know. So it's really worthwhile. But don't ever do, if I can offer some advice, don't ever do an accelerator for investment. You should get investment by having a great company. Investors will come to you. You don't go to an accelerator because the accelerator will guarantee investment, unless the accelerator itself is investing, like 500 and Dream It. That's different. Go to it to learn how to run a great company. And on that front, I must call out the incredible team at the DMZ because that's how their whole philosophy is founders first. Abdullah and this whole team, and their focus on let's just bring you mentors in different parts of your company and just help you be a better company. And that's what they really helped us to do.
And so just as one last question, perhaps before we start wrapping up, it's obviously, this has been a super weird year and like a incredibly weird week on top of that. And it looks like there will be a Biden presidency. How do you anticipate and what are you telling your customers to expect as you look forward to probably the continuation of Obamacare and a different approach to the pandemic and to healthcare access?
Yeah, definitely. The one thing I think everybody needs to realize is while US and even other parts of the world think about changes in administration and policy, nobody ever says healthcare isn't important. It's like the biggest topic. It's true, President Trump and President-elect Biden think about, and their administrations think about healthcare differently, but it's at the top of the priority list. And it's always economy, environment, foreign policy, healthcare in some order. And why? That's because it requires rethinking. The prevalence of chronic conditions. 98% of the US GDP spent on healthcare is on chronic conditions, and the percentage of GDP spent on healthcare continues to go up. Yep. And it isn't because people made bad decisions, it's because our population is aging, people are becoming busier, there's more stress, there's more factors affecting healthcare, health, and therefore healthcare. And then you have the sort of left field factor of people taking more control over their health, whether it's quantified self and the prevalence of the Apple Watch and what have you, the shift that the Fitbit had created. All of these things kind of come together. And when we were first building MedStack, that's what we said. We said, there is a greater appetite for paying attention to healthcare innovation. Healthcare is going digital with the prevalence of the EMR, and people are more comfortable with their health being digital because of quantified self. And so I think that the devil is if I can use that word, is another layer down in the details. And I think, obviously what President Obama had tried to do was address one of the biggest tragedies and crises in the US healthcare system, which is inability to access care by some elements of our population, and to make that easier. And healthcare access is actually the underlying sort of underpinning theme of all these policy conversations. Well, if you think about it, isn't the whole field of digital health in the field of healthcare access, making it easier to know what care you need, easier to get the care, easier to access the care, easier to pay for and fund the care? These are all the things that all of our customers and everybody working in digital health are trying to do. Telemedicine is now the fastest growing software category in all software for that reason. And what's really interesting is with the tragedy around COVID-19 and all of the terrible things that it's done, it has brought to light, to attention, the advantage and the potential of digital health that those of us working in this industry have been saying for a while. We just felt like we didn't necessarily have the push and the impetus to do it. And now I'm very upset that it happened. I'm very glad to be working in an industry that can respond to it. And so I think, if President-elect Biden is successful in taking the presidency, then we will see things like a greater focus on conversations around democratized access to healthcare with the continuation of Obamacare. I think it's very interesting that Vice President-elect Harris has a history of policing and looking at things like mergers in healthcare, because that's a really interesting thing. Competition breeds innovation, which maybe is an argument for more privatized healthcare as the Trump administration would defend. But we also have this history of companies merging together and companies buying other companies, which creates imbalances in power in the innovation cycle and makes it really hard for startups to be successful. And I think perhaps the Biden presidency may help that. So you might have, on one hand, more government oversight, which in some cases can cause bureaucracy and innovation, but as well a defense against power centricity from a for-profit perspective that might allow people to be hungrier to compete and to deliver on innovation, as well as attention to healthcare access.
Exactly, and I think that'll be more focused on marginalized populations and vulnerable populations. We've got to do something about it, and there are the new business models that are coming together to allow that.
For sure.
This has been a totally fascinating hour and review of sort of what has happened from your perspective with the growth of technology over many years. So really fascinating. Balaji, to end, 5 one-word answers to a Proust questionnaire.
Sure, let's do it.
Favorite food?
Pasta.
There we go. A memorable book?
The Power of One by Bryce Courtney.
Carl Lowry or
yes.
Carl Lowry or Christine Sinclair?
Lowry.
Yeah, I can go there. What's your guilty pleasure?
My guilty pleasure are stupid big box action movies. I wish I could say I was artistic, but I'm not.
And lastly, one word that you'd like to leave people with?
Courage.
That is, courage, serendipity in how things happen in a career, passion for a mission, innovation, discipline, the commitment to values, and having a product vision and lived experience. So I think are all words that would describe you. So
thank you so much.
As a great Canadian entrepreneur. So thank you very much. It's been a real pleasure talking to you.
Likewise.
And thank you everyone for joining us today.
Thank you, everybody. Be safe.
Thank you.